I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. The DUP say progress has been made on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but the Prime Minister now faces a key moment to strike the right deal. Rishi Sunak held talks with Stormont leaders this morning in an attempt to resolve the contentious post-Brexit trading arrangements. The Prime Minister will meet EU leaders in Germany tomorrow. Amid speculation, a deal could be unveiled early next week. Sinn Féin believe an agreement's absolutely possible. Jeffrey Donaldson says the immediate future of the province is at stake.
The decisions that will be taken by the Prime Minister and by the European Commission will either consign Northern Ireland to more division, or they will clear a path towards healing and to the restoration of the political institutions. Clearly, there will be further discussions between the UK government and the European Union, but I think it is safe to say that progress has been made across a range of areas, but there are still some areas where further work is required.
A former security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin, caught spying for Russia, has been sentenced to more than 13 years in jail. David Smith's admitted to handing classified documents to the Russians. He refused, though, to name his alleged handler. He was caught in an undercover MI5 sting by fake Russian agents. Smith said he was merely trying to embarrass the embassy and was suffering from depression. But Mr. Justice Wall, in sentencing, said Smith had put people at maximum risk.
You did it by stealth, using the opportunities provided to you by your employment to visit various offices in the embassy at night when others had gone home and take photographs of classified documents on your telephone or camera. A number of these documents were clearly marked as secret. Others were of a lower classification, but were still obviously not for dissemination beyond the embassy.
The SNP has postponed a conference on independence following the resignation of the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. It comes as the party's executive committee said a ballot to select the new leader will close on the 27th of March. The Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, has already announced he will not be entering the race. The Scottish Government, meanwhile, has offered healthcare staff an average 6.5% pay rise. Workers would also receive a one-off payment of between £400 and £900. Matt McLaughlin, Unison Scotland's head of health, has called it a credible pay offer that deserves serious consideration. The Royal College of Nursing has announced a new 48-hour strike in England. Members from 128 NHS trusts will walk out on March the 1st. In an escalation, the RCN says will reduce services to an absolute minimum. Nurses in emergency, intensive and cancer care, all previously exempted, will join the picket lines for the first time. However, the union says life and limb care will continue. Meanwhile, patients in the West Midlands are facing more delays as ambulance workers join the picket lines today. Members of the GMB and Unite unions are staging a walkout in their long-running dispute over pay and staffing. The unions say they're waiting for a decent offer. The government says it continues talks with the unions. The Home Secretary has asked for an explanation over the disclosure of Nicola Bulley's private life. Suella Braverman's questioned why Lancashire Police disclosed the details at a press conference. The Force says Ms Bulley suffered significant issues with alcohol in the past and was struggling with the perimenopause. Lancashire Police have referred themselves to the police watchdog. The Shadow Justice Secretary Steve Reid says it's the right thing to do.
The police should not be sharing extremely private personal information about an individual without the consent of that individual, if they are available to give it, and if they're not, then without the consent of their close family members. If they do that, they run the risk that other victims won't feel confident coming forwards in future. So I think it's right this case is now being reviewed. We will see where this particular case comes out, but the principles are that the confidentiality of victims must always be respected by the police.
And thousands of homes have been left without power and dozens of schools closed as Storm Otto hit Scotland and the northeast of England. The Met Office says winds up to 80 miles an hour were recorded across parts of Scotland earlier. The energy company SSEN says at least 30,000 properties will be without power for some time. It may take 48 hours to fully restore supplies. A weather warning is in place until 3 o'clock for most of Scotland, so another hour or so. It stopped at 2 o'clock, so a few minutes ago, for North East England. Well, this is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. But now it's back to the briefing with Arlene Foster.
Well, the likelihood of a deal between the UK and the EU on the vexed question of the Northern Ireland Protocol appears to be getting closer, in theory, at least. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has jetted off to Belfast and has been holding talks with all of the key parties in Northern Ireland in an attempt to persuade them of the merits of his plan. But the question of the role of the EU courts continues to loom large, with widespread suggestions that the DUP and some of Mr Sunak's own MPs will reject any oversights from Brussels. We'll now cross live to Belfast and our political reporter, Olivia Otley. Olivia, bring us up to date.
Yes, Rishi Sunak has been here in Northern Ireland this morning meeting the leaders of the major parties to try to get them to agree to the terms of his new Brexit deal, which is supposed to solve the problems that were created by the protocol. And we've had two press conferences here, one from Sinn Féin, one from the DUP. Sinn Féin said, or they didn't quite say that a deal had been struck or that they were agreeing a deal, but that they felt the game was very much on. The DUP too, Geoffrey Donaldson, sounded more optimistic perhaps than many might have expected. He mentioned progress 3 times during his press conference. But that said, he did say that there were still areas where clarity needed to be reached. And perhaps most worryingly for Rishi Sunak, he said that he wasn't that concerned about timescales. When asked if he would reach if a deal would be reached this week, he said he didn't mind when it happened, he just wanted it to be the right deal. So now Rishi Sunak has gone off. We saw him leave a couple of hours ago to Munich, where he's going to talk to EU leaders about this deal. And if that all gets agreed, he's hoping to put it to Parliament on Tuesday. That won't be plain sailing either, because in Parliament he will have the ERG, who aren't happy at all about the way this deal has been handled. They feel they've been cut out of the decision-making process, but it's likely that a deal would cross the line with help from Labour, though that probably isn't exactly what the Prime Minister would hope for.
Olivia, they're live from the Culloden Hotel just outside Belfast. Thank you very much. And a very busy man sweeping up behind you there. And it's good to see the industry going on there in Belfast. But earlier I spoke to the former Brexit Minister and Deputy Chair of the European Research Group of his understanding of where we now are with the negotiations between the European Union and the UK.
I think number 10 has been pretty tight-lipped, and all that I'm gleaning is probably what everyone else is gleaning, which is newspaper reports. It looks as if they're going to propose a deal to the UK that we should have red and green channels for the admittance of goods into Northern Ireland, and that there should be a more low-key role for the European Court of Justice. But beyond that, I really haven't heard, and I think that we do need that detail so that we can make an assessment of whether or not whatever deal is proposed is acceptable not only to the people of Northern Ireland, but the people of the UK as a whole.
I mean, David, you've been involved with this protocol since its inception almost. Did you understand that it was to be a temporary provision when you seen it in the withdrawal agreement? Is that your understanding of the protocol?
Yes, and the reason for that is that the protocol says on the face of it, effectively, that it's to be a temporary arrangement. If you look at Article 13.8, it actually contemplates what will happen to replace the protocol in due course. And it was only because the protocol was presented as a temporary state of affairs that I think that Parliament approved it when it voted on it back in 2019. So really, the fact that the EU is sticking to the protocol and in fact has been very insistent upon adhering to the letter of the protocol is extremely disappointing. And quite clearly, we've got to replace it.
And part of their sticking to the protocol is that they continue to say that they are protecting the Belfast Agreement, David, and you and I both know that that's simply not the case. And in actual fact, they're damaging the Belfast Agreement.
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. The Belfast Agreement actually says that there should be no constitutional changes in Northern Ireland without the consent of the majority of its people. And it's very important to note, too, that the very first article of the protocol, Article 1, says in terms that the protocol itself is without prejudice to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So it's acknowledging that, if you like, it's acknowledging the primacy of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and recognizing that the protocol itself is subordinate to that agreement.
David, I wanted to ask you about the negotiation strategy of the Prime Minister and the fact that the protocol bill has been paused. As you know, it was meant to come to the House of Lords and it hasn't. Do you think that that is a good strategy, given that we are trying to get the European Union to face up to the fact that that's not working, the protocol is not working, and that it should be replaced?
No, I actually think it's the wrong strategy. History shows that the European Union will only respond when pressure is applied to it. And in fact, some time ago, Boris Johnson proved that when he threatened to withdraw David Frost from the talks, when there was a particularly difficult moment in the negotiations with the EU. And as soon as he did that, the EU immediately softened its position. And started talking more sensibly. And I think that we have got the ideal vehicle in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which enables the UK unilaterally to disapply these rules as they apply to Northern Ireland if they can't come to terms with the UK on it. The bill empowers the government to take those steps. And it's another weapon in the arsenal of the government. And I think it is really quite the wrong policy to leave it becalmed as it is in the shallows of the House of Lords. I think that the government should be pressing on with that as quickly as possible, insisting that the House of Lords passes it. If the House of Lords won't pass it, then invoking the Parliament Act so that the House of Commons can unilaterally again ensure that legislation goes through. I think that is the right way to do it because it shows determination on the part of the British government, which is what we do need to do in these negotiations.
Indeed, and you will remember well that both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss during the leadership hustings both said that they were committed to the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, but that seems to have shifted since the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, came into office.
I'm afraid it has. And you know, we received assurances from a number of candidates prior to that election that they would press ahead with the bill. I think that the Prime Minister, after his meetings in Belfast today, should reflect upon sentiment in Northern Ireland and particularly in the unionist community, and decide whether the strategy which he seems to have adopted of a softly approach to the European Union is the correct one. And maybe, I hope, after taking further advice, decide that he has to press on with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. There are certain things that we need to do because the measures that we're seeing at the moment, it seems to me, are primarily cosmetic. We're seeing new arrangements for the passage of goods into Northern Ireland, which doesn't actually obviate the need for checks anyway. And we're seeing still the supremacy of the European Court of Justice, although it's said that will be through a filter of the Northern Ireland courts, which, as a matter of fact, was always the case anyway.
Yes, exactly.
What we do need to see, I think, Arlene, is to move to a state of affairs where European law no longer applies in Northern Ireland at all. And if we arrive at that state of affairs, then we needn't worry about the European Court of Justice because it won't have any role anyway. Yes,
and that's the critical point, is it not, to recognise the internal market of the United Kingdom as opposed to pushing Northern Ireland into the single market of the European Union and outside of the single market of the United Kingdom. And that's the crux of everything that we're talking about.
I think that's right. And of course, there are ways in which you can protect both the EU single market and the UK's own internal market, and that is by adopting a process of mutual enforcement.
Correct.
Whereby each side undertakes to be responsible for ensuring that any goods leaving its territory and moving into the territory of the other party complies with the other party's regulations.
Yeah.
That's something that was proposed quite a few years ago now, and in fact it was floated to Michel Barnier, who I understand was quite attracted by that proposal. And it's a very unusual state of affairs where a government of one country or one bloc actually has legislative authority in the territory of another country. And it's a very strange state of affairs where a foreign court has jurisdiction in another state. It is anomalous and doesn't normally happen. And I think we have to get away from that approach when deciding what the permanent arrangement is going to be between the UK and the European Union over Northern Ireland.
Well, we'll wait to see where it goes after today, David. But in the meantime, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Arlene. Pleasure.
Well, Asa Bennett is with me throughout this hour. He's the former chief speechwriter for Liz Truss. Asa, what did you make of that assessment from David Jones? He's the deputy chair of the ERG, so we know he's going to be sceptical about everything. But what did you make of it all?
Well, it's a very strong intervention from David, because I think he's representing the Brexiteer opinion on the protocol, which is that, frankly, it's unsustainable, and that's been recognised by the EU actually in negotiations. And we can see the Northern Ireland communities, the parties, they agree it cannot go on the way it is. That's why Stormont is not sitting, because you need to have all communities represented and happy. And, you know, as we know, it's that, you know, the Brexiteers, and I think the DUP would say, the problems are baked into the text of the protocol. So you have to reopen it to fundamentally rewire this. Otherwise, the EU is just going to tinker around the edges. You know, and so that's why he's saying you have to go really further and faster. Granted, the interesting thing otherwise, he highlighted in my mind, is that, you know, Number 10, they've not officially confirmed this. We're just seeing sort of curious choreography going on where Rishi Sunak's jetting off to Belfast to talk to them about, who knows, probably the deal. And because one thing he'll definitely know, the Prime Minister, is that, you know, as Prime Ministers before have shown, you do not underestimate the DUP, you do not underestimate Brexiteers. They will not be sold a pup. They will want to see the detail, and that is what will be key.
I thought it was interesting that most of the parties spent quite a short time with the Prime Minister. I think they were given 15-minute slots. The DUP were in almost 2 hours, I think, with them. They went in after 10:30 and they didn't come out till after 12:30. What should we be reading into that, Asa?
Well, simply that the DUP are the key crowd to try and convince, because they represent the unionist opinion, the unionist community. The other parties, they're pro-protocol.
Yes.
They are pro-implementing the thing,
rigorous implementation,
exactly.
I think is the word you're looking
Rip the
for.
safeguards off, go full throttle on the protocol. That's what we agree with the EU, no holding back. So they're keen, they want to get this over with. But the DUP, they understandably can see the problems. And I'll just quickly remind viewers of this.
Sure.
It's that if you try and you've got customs arrangements, which means you have to fill out reams of paperwork if you want to send things, either like presents or parcels across from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. If you want to import your pets, for example, you have to do veterinary assessments and all sorts. If you, for example, the UK government wants to cut taxes and for them to benefit people in Northern Ireland or to subsidise businesses in Northern Ireland, they have to ask the EU's permission.
Correct.
And you have the European Court of Justice having to ride roughshod over what happens in Northern Ireland. They get to intervene and stick their oars in. And so this is, on sovereignty, on trade, on customs. It chips away.
It's very fundamental, and I think sometimes people don't realise just how fundamental it is, actually.
The sense of identity.
What you're really doing is allowing the European Union, without any representation from Northern Ireland, to make laws for Northern Ireland, which surely is not right.
It's a democratic deficit.
A huge democratic deficit, absolutely. Well, we'll see what happens next. He's off to Munich, and we'll talk about that later on. But I'm sure there'll be many conversations about the protocol and about what's happening with the EU. But coming up, former Deputy Chief of Defence Staff Sir Simon Mail is going to join me in the studio to talk about that Munich Security Conference, where 40 world leaders and 100 ministers of foreign affairs and defence are expected to attend. But before that, let's take a short break.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, at 9:30 on Sunday morning when I'll be asking Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the 1922 Committee of Backbench Tories, how the party plans to win the next general election without Boris Johnson. And Callum Best, son of Manchester United legend George Best, will be telling me what it was like to live in the shadow of a flawed genius. All that and more at 9:30 on Sunday.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion. People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the show. Well, this weekend, the great and the good of the military world are arriving in Bavaria for the Munich Security Conference. Rishi Sunak, Ben Wallace and James Cleverly will all be in attendance, as well as leaders from around the world. The conference comes a week before the anniversary of the Ukraine invasion and at a time when the Defence Secretary is pushing for greater spending on defence in the upcoming budget. Well, delighted to say that joining me now is former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Simon Mail. Well, obviously, Ukraine's going to be a big focus, Simon, of this conference, but it's not the only focus.
Not at all. The Munich Security Conference is that. It's not a defence conference. It has been running since 1963. And if you look at the agenda, it is looking at things like migration, it's looking at water, it's looking at starvation or, food security.
Oh, right. Okay.
But undoubtedly, the interesting thing is this conference was held last year, 4 or 5 days, I think, before Putin invaded Ukraine.
And was Russia there last year?
Russia was there last year.
Oh, right, okay.
Not there this year, as you well know. And at that stage, there were still mixed messages. I think the British and the American intelligence services were actually saying he's going to do it. And you'll recall the French intelligence services were rather implying to President Macron he wasn't going to do it.
Oh, I remember that.
And he got sacked, and for which the guy got sacked.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting now, a year further on, that largely the same cast of characters in terms of defence ministers, chiefs of defence will be there. And that undoubtedly will be the biggest focus. But you're absolutely right to say, in principle, the security conference is about much more than defence.
Yeah.
But inevitably, the focus is very firmly on Ukraine.
And because it is a global conference, will China be there, for example?
I think China is there.
Yeah.
I'm assuming there's good, because part of it is, again, from its origins, was about the transatlantic link. When it was set up, it was right in the middle of the Cold War, and giving a chance for American, Canadian diplomats, politicians, military, to meet the European counterparts. This year, I understand on the agenda is certainly some discussion of the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay.
And of course, China is looked on as definitely a peer competitor. The Americans are quite bullish about just what that means, and the whole thing with balloons and stuff going around there. So it's very interesting that the personal dynamics between so many of the individuals there, and the sort of second twin tier discussions going on, the sidebar discussions, the brush bys, the serendipity of bumping into somebody and just sort of thing actually that unfortunately during COVID just shows you couldn't hold this on Zoom.
No.
Or you wouldn't get half the benefit. It's a bit like the Oscars, or dare I say, it's a military Davos, really.
Yeah. I always say these meetings you get most done actually outside of the main rooms, don't you?
Absolutely.
And because you're chatting to people in the side rooms and what have you.
That's right. And it's amazing how you see the opening, everybody's there. I've not done Munich, but I've done several similar ones.
Yeah.
And then gradually as you get through the programme, people thin out. The the key leaders are inevitably dashing off to do something else. Sure. But in the meantime, their diary would be absolutely stacked up with, 15, 20, 30-minute meetings with people vital. And that classic requirement to look somebody in the eyes and say, do you understand what I'm saying, or do I understand what you're saying? You just can't put a price on it in terms of dispelling lack of confidence or lack of trust or uncertainty.
We had a former ambassador to the US with me a couple of weeks ago, Lord Renwick, and he was saying that art of personal diplomacy had been somewhat lost, not just because of COVID, but because some of the players didn't believe in it in the fashion that George H.W. Bush believed in it. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, God bless Zoom and all the the internet connections, etc. And without them, it really would be difficult.
Sure. Yeah.
And I know people get very criticised, so-and-so's taken up, planes, those carbon footprints, this, that and the other. But what's occasionally at stake is absolutely right that the leaders eyeball each other, frankly, and have those frank discussions to pass messages on, sometimes, and sometimes quite harsh messages. We saw recently talk about the Americans being critical of the British defence capability at the moment, or worried as a critical friend.
Yeah.
And these things are always easier done between friends who know each other.
I just want to pick up on that capability, of course, because the budget's coming up in March. We know that Ben Wallace has been worried about what's going to be allocated to the Defence Ministry. Are you hearing any rumours around all of that?
Not particularly. I know the chiefs, and in CDS, I suspect Admiral Radican will be, I'm guessing, at Munich alongside Ben Wallace. What I am surprised about is that normally, when you go on operations, the military are funded for a certain level of activity.
Sure.
As soon as you move into operations, you go to the Treasury and you say, this is, what we're going to do now is above the core funding. And my assumption would have been that Ben Wallace would have spoken to the Treasury and said, as far as we're concerned, this is the same as an operation. We are going to expend training, we're going to expend manpower, we're going to expend ammunition, particularly, and stocks that we have of anti-tank weapons. And you must sign here to say you will replace them ASAP back into our inventory. So I think that's what we're seeing, that nervousness behind behind things. And totally understanding, of course, the national priorities. None of us are naive about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm going to turn to you because obviously you were the chief speechwriter for Liz Truss. Liz Truss, would she have listened very closely to what Ben Wallace had to say about his defence spending?
Well, absolutely. I think that's why she promised to, not just exceed the NATO target of 2% of our GDP on defence, but to take it up to 3% over the decade, because it's to cement, if you like, the status the UK has long had of, the biggest defence spender in Europe and someone that's really able to use its heft for good, as we're seeing in our leadership on Ukraine. Yeah, and
I mean, he's obviously concerned about that coming up. There's always ministerial jostling coming up to a budget, as you will know. Where will the other big pressures come from, as well as defence, in these budget negotiations that are coming up?
I think there'll be, you're right, competing pressures. There's defence, of course, and then
health, presumably.
Health, absolutely. The NHS is a titanic amount in the budget, and then the DWP with pensions, because of course you've got cost of living, and it is one of the biggest departments of the lot. So anything that's cost of living and health will be also competing for attention.
Yeah, and do you think, Simon, that people here in the UK understand the need to invest in their defence budget, or will they be more interested in the health education space?
Well, they will be, but I think that's the duty of leaders, is to explain and occasionally just lay out the facts. And it's easier in many ways to be willfully put money into areas that are good headline grabbers when you're coming up to an election. They're important, of course they are. Nobody's denying the importance of investment in education, health, etc. But sometimes you have to say that all of this, I think it was Dennis Healey who said...
It's about our place in the world.
It's about our place in the world, and it is about the ultimate responsibility of government. And Dennis Healey, I think, once said the ultimate social security is defence. Because without that, then actually all that other expenditure, as history teaches, is wasted. So I think the public are grown up enough about this. I don't mean that patronisingly. They admire our armed forces. I think they're disappointed at the moment, as I would be, and embarrassed slightly that there are questions where we have the French or the Germans or the Americans, implying that we couldn't take on our commitments. I mean, Ben Wallace has been very clear that yes, we can. I'm not going to repeat his words for that one. But there is a mark of leadership. This invasion has changed the whole environment and context within which we need to address all aspects, frankly, of Western society and spending and tax raising, etc.
Yeah. So, Simon, thanks for coming into the studio. Really appreciate
Huge
that.
pleasure, as always. Thank you.
We'll discuss the Munich conference and the outworkings of that more with Asa later on. But coming up, Liz Truss has made her first overseas speech since leaving office, and Asa Bennett, the ex-PM's former speechwriter, is here. I'm going to ask him what he made of it. But first, here's the news headlines.
It is just after 2:30. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. We'll start with some breaking news from the last few minutes. It's been announced the Welsh ambulance drivers will go on strike from Monday to Wednesday next week. In a tweet, the service said it would be significantly impacted. So more on that as soon as we get it here at GB News. Meanwhile, the DUP says progress has been made on the Northern Ireland Protocol following discussions in Belfast with the Prime Minister. But further work will be required. Rishi Sunak held talks with Stormont leaders earlier in an attempt to resolve contentious post-Brexit trading arrangements. Now, the Prime Minister will meet EU leaders in Germany tomorrow amid speculation a deal could be unveiled early next week. Sinn Féin's President, Mary Lou McDonald, says an agreement is absolutely possible.
Ongoing access to the European single market, no hardening of the border on the island of Ireland, and a protection of the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts. Those are the core elements and aspects that need to be protected. But it seems to us that it's very much game on, and we're very heartened by that. We're very, very conscious that a deal can be done, should now be concluded speedily. We hope that that will be the case.
The Scottish National Party has postponed a conference on independence following the resignation of First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. The party's executive committee says a ballot to select the new leader will close on the 27th of March. John Swinney, the Deputy First Minister, has already ruled himself out of entering the race. Meanwhile, the Scottish Government's offered healthcare staff there an average 6.5% pay rise. Workers would also receive a one-off payment of between £400 and £900. Unison Scotland's Head of Health, Matt McLaughlin, says it's a credible pay offer and it deserves serious consideration. TV online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News, but now it is back to the briefing with Arlene Foster.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB plus radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like.
Absolutely.
On Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Welcome back to the show. Well, it's now been 3 weeks since Nicola Bulley went missing in Lancashire whilst walking her dog. Earlier this week, police revealed details including Bulley's struggles with alcohol and the menopause. This has led to the Home Secretary asking for an explanation as to why Lancashire Police felt the need to disclose these personal details. Yesterday, a spokesperson for the Home Office said it was receiving regular updates from the force about its handling of the case. A statement said, "Our thoughts are with Nicola Bulley's family at this incredibly difficult time. The Home Secretary and Policing Minister are receiving regular updates from Lancashire Police on its handling of this case, including why personal details about Nicola was briefed out at this stage of the investigation." Shadow Justice Secretary Steve Reid also spoke earlier today after he gave a speech in London to reform the criminal justice system. Well, we're going to go live.
The police should not be sharing extremely private, personal information about an individual without the consent of that individual, if they are available to give it, and if they're not, then without the consent of their close family members. If they do that, they run the risk that other victims won't feel confident coming forwards in future. So I think it's right, this case is now being reviewed. We will see where this particular case comes out, but the principles are that the confidentiality of victims must always be respected by the police.
Keir Starmer has also said that he's uncomfortable with the way in which details came out around Nicola Bulley. We now go live to GB News North West of England reporter Sophie Reaper. Sophie, bring us up to date with what's going on today.
Well, it's now been 3 weeks since mother of two Nicola Bulley went missing. That's 21 days since the day she first disappeared. And yet, still, the facts remain very thin on the ground. I'll walk you through exactly what we do know thus far, though. We know that that morning she woke up and loaded the car because we've seen images from her Ring doorbell. We know that she then took her two children to the local primary school. She dropped them off and leaving the car in the car park, she walked along the path here, across the bridge you can see behind me, and down this path here towards the bench that we've all seen so much of in the press over the past 3 weeks. We know that at 9:01 she logged into a Teams call, although her camera did remain off. At 9:10, she was spotted by someone who knows her on the upper field. And from then on, it all becomes a little bit more murky. 23 minutes later, her phone is found on that bench by someone who doesn't know her. And from then on, we don't really know much else. So the facts, as I say, are very thin on the ground, but what this case lacks in facts is made up for in controversies. Last week, SGI, an independent search team, joined Lancashire Police in trying to find Nicola in the river, which was, of course, their main working hypothesis. But after 3 days, founder Peter Faulding pulled out of the search, saying that he believes Nicola is not in the stretch of river where they were searching. Then earlier this week, in a press conference with Lancashire Police, they told us that the moment Nicola was reported as missing, she was graded as high risk. Now, they told us it was because of specific vulnerabilities, but that at the time they were unable to tell us what those vulnerabilities were. However, that evening, they made a complete 180 on that decision and somewhat controversially revealed that information to the public. They said that in the past she had had significant issues with alcohol as a result of the menopause. Now, the decision to reveal that information has been widely criticised. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, has asked why they did that. And earlier on today, the Information Commissioner, John Edwards, has said, "We recognise that at this stage of an intensive live investigation, the force must focus all their energies on the inquiry. But given the high-profile nature of this case, we will be asking Lancashire Police to set out how they reached the decision to disclose this information in due course." So, of course, that was a controversial decision, and the search does continue to try and find an answer to the question, what has happened to Nicola Bulley?
Sophie, thank you so much for that update. And indeed, the former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales has said all of this is as sexist as it comes because, of course, it's linked to the menopause. Just quickly, this is a strange case, is it not?
It's very bizarre. I mean, as soon as the police are saying there's specific vulnerabilities, they're clearly almost volunteering practically too much information about this.
Yeah.
And now they're desperately trying to row it back. have themselves audited, and so they deserve, who knows what they'll get.
It's very strange, and I thought 2 weeks ago it was strange, but anyway, we hope and pray that Nicola is found well. The departure of the First Minister of Scotland, however, could herald in a new era for the Labour Party in Scotland, a party that dominated the country for decades but was reduced to just one seat in 2015. Might the fall of Nicola Sturgeon now offer Labour the chance to retake many of their old heartlands? Might it shorten that path to number 10? Let's speak to our Scotland reporter, Tony Maguire.
Hello, yes, welcome to the Assembly Rooms in Edinburgh, where the question of the day has very much been how will Scottish Labour capitalise on all this recent motion? So obviously we've seen down in England a lot of voters potentially, a lot can change in a year, but potentially moving over to Labour. And up in Scotland, certainly Labour will be hoping to have a little bit more than one seat with Ian Murray. I spoke to the Deputy Leader of Scottish Labour today, and she, Jackie Baillie, was quite happy about how things were looking. Let's listen in.
For 15 years, the SNP have been in charge in Scotland, and for 15 years they've failed to deliver on their reason for being, which is independence. They've now lost probably their best political asset in terms of Nicola Sturgeon, although I have to say for her successor there is an in-tray bulging with problems. People, when they meet Keir Starmer in Scotland, and he's been up a number of times, they like what they see. But they see this as an opportunity not to talk just about independence, but actually to talk about the things that matter to them. The cost of living crisis, the NHS crisis, tackling economic growth. And Labour are coming up with the answers. We are in a position, for the first time in a long time, of actually being able to boot out the Tories from number 10 and also to offer the people of Scotland a credible alternative to the SNP.
So thanks, Tony, up there at the Labour conference in Scotland. We're going to ask Asa what he made of that. Obviously, this is manna from heaven for the Labour Party in Scotland, is it not?
Completely. Anna Sarwar's dreams have come true. The SNP have lost the biggest referendum they've ever had. They've lost, the two biggest electoral assets, Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, and the independence movement is splintered, so this is their chance for a comeback. If for Labour to then win a national majority, they need to be winning in Scotland.
They do, yeah, they do. But I have to say, Anna Sarwar and the Labour Party in Scotland supported those gender recognition changes in Scotland. So how do they differentiate themselves from the SNP on issues such as that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. They are knee-deep in all this, so they have to then learn from the mistakes Nicola Sturgeon said. And no doubt if Anas is agile, he'll come back with a response which he can therefore own the legacy, but also take it forward, explain, answering questions about, now the parole boards are being more closely supervised, try and be more sort of deft in this, because he's going to have his own fair share of questions given the involvement. But the thing is, he is a slick customer. He is able to then move on to the core issues they want to talk about, like cost of living, the NHS, why the SNP, in short, are very good at campaigning, but terrible at governing.
And what I always found strange was the fact that people in Scotland voted for the SNP, didn't necessarily agree with their politics on independence, but they voted for them in terms of the devolved administration, despite the fact that we have all of those drug problems, we have all of the issues in the health service and in education as well. But the SNP still managed to get the vote out.
Absolutely. I think it's because Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP became a sort of symbol of, stronger for Scotland. So if you either pro-Scotland or anti by voting for the other lot. And so now we're moving past that. We're realising that, political gravity is taking hold on the SNP. They are being held to account for these problems. That Nicola Sturgeon is wriggling under scrutiny, and she knows the dream of independence is dying. That's why she's bowing out before it's too late.
And my goodness, the Labour Party will be... imagine having a conference planned for this weekend after what happened this week. It's something for them to stand on their platform on. And the SNP, they have cancelled their conference on independence. So they'll take some time, I would presume, to think about the way forward, will they not?
Absolutely, yes, because they'll be divided and drifting. They have to have a contest now to really work out in this battle of ideas where next. Because you've got some independence campaigners who felt that, you could practically talk your way into another referendum. Sturgeon's tried that. She's failed. So they have to work out what next.
OK, yes, well, I'm sure we'll be returning to the subject of Scotland for many more weeks and months to come. Well, in the early hours of this morning, Liz Truss made her first public overseas engagement since leaving office. The former Prime Minister addressed parliamentarians from around the world at the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China in Tokyo. Truss warned that the next few years are going to be critical for the future of freedom in the face of strategic issues posed by China. And joining me now is the CEO of Hong Kong Watch and author of China Nexus, Benedict Rogers. And you've brought us in a copy of your book. Thank you very much, Benedict, for doing that. And, of course, Liz Truss's former chief speechwriter, Asa Bennett, is staying with me as well. Have you had a chance, Benedict, to look at what Liz Truss has said today? And what did you make of it if you did?
I have, and I think she's absolutely right. There wasn't a word that I would disagree with, and I really welcome the fact that we have not just a very senior politician, but a former Prime Minister saying what she said. I think for too long we have been asleep at the switch on China.
And so I noticed that Philip Hammond was writing about China this week as well. So we've two different views, if you like, on China. He was talking about giving primacy to trade and making sure that we understood the importance of doing business with China, despite the, I think in quotes, it was the background noise. My goodness, what a way to describe what's happening in Taiwan, in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs.
Exactly. I never thought that I would use this phrase about a fellow Conservative, but I would say that Philip Hammond is in danger of falling into what Lenin described as useful idiots territory, to describe the genocide of the Uyghurs, the increased hostility to Taiwan, and the increased aggression to our own freedoms through China's infiltration and influence campaign. To describe that as background noise is extraordinary.
I thought it was extraordinary. I'd be interested to hear what Asa has to say about this. What did you make of Philip Hammond's piece in China Daily?
So I'm very struck by his use of the language, calling for a return to business as usual, because and the background noise was a remarkable way of dismissing what we've seen over the years, the encroachment of freedoms in Hong Kong, all that's been going on in Xinjiang. It's almost like he doesn't want to try and understand why there is this response, why there are concerns expressed about China's aggressive authoritarianism.
I thought it was also interesting, Asa, that he took us back to the Osborne period, and he said, George Osborne was the man who, really started this golden era between the UK and China. He was a bit sceptical, but then he realised the importance of it. Are you a bit concerned about the fact that George Osborne has influence in Downing Street now with Rishi Sunak in place?
So I think I can understand one aspect of this argument that he's alluding to, which is that China is a huge economy, a major trading partner. So obviously he's trying to say you can't completely pretend they're no longer there. We can't disappear them away as an inconvenience. We have to have some sort of dealings with them. But at the same time, yes, I think if I may point to then Liz Truss's speech, effectively what she's trying to sort of say is that, the lessons we've learned since we rolled out the red carpet in those years, and she was there in these red carpet,
as was I from Northern Ireland,
Oh, you'll remember then how sort of almost grovellingly, cravenly pleased we were, trying to woo them at any cost to try and do more business, taking, the president for a pint at the local pub. I remember David Cameron was snapped.
I remember that.
It was very, very matey. But at that point, it was like a blind eye was turned to what was happening on values, human rights and everything else. It was trade almost at any cost. But now I think Liz is trying to effectively argue that, we can't be caught napping now. We were caught, we were asleep at the wheel with Russia. Putin warned us that he had us eyeing up Ukraine. And now we're seeing, President Xi doing the same with Taiwan. We've seen what they do in Hong Kong. They're turning their sights to Taiwan. We cannot fall asleep again. We have to be vigilant. It's a clarion call for action.
Yeah, and she actually makes reference to some quotes from President Xi about Taiwan, and he says the historical task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. I mean, I'm thinking, just when you mentioned Putin, of his words about Ukraine and the greater Russia. And Liz Truss is right to point that out, is she not?
She is, absolutely. I mean, for too long we heard what Vladimir Putin said about Ukraine and we didn't believe it, and we were proven wrong. I think we have to take what Xi Jinping is saying seriously, and the only thing that's in question is not his intention, it's the timing and manner of how he intends to achieve his goal.
Yeah, and obviously we have spoken a lot about Hong Kong, and bring us up to date with how things are going there at the moment, Benedict.
Well, it's an appalling situation. Basically, all of Hong Kong's freedoms now have been totally dismantled. I used to be in daily contact with people in Hong Kong. I now can't because most of the people I know are either in prison or those who aren't in prison are keeping their heads down, and I don't want to endanger them. And crucially, just over a week or so ago, the biggest trial on under the national security law began, and it's a trial of 47 former legislators and activists whose only crime was to hold a primary election to choose their candidates to contest the Legislative Council election. So, I mean, think of how many elections you've stood in. You could be locked up simply for, or at least your, former party members for taking part in a contest to choose candidates.
It's an incredible state of affairs. But yes, I wanted to talk to you about the review of the integrated review on defence. And when Liz Truss was in office, she said, we need to look at this again. We need to review the review as such. Why is that an important document? Tell us about that.
It's basically the gospel text for foreign policy. It governs how we approach the world. It outlines our strategy, makes clear what we see as our priorities. The last integrated review, and I'll spare everyone the technocratic babble, it was written before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yes.
It didn't fully realise, clearly, it wasn't aware, it wasn't flagging up in lights how much of a danger it could be. It's not quite clocked, and that's why it's being updated to reflect on, China's aggression in, towards Taiwan, its militancy generally, its increasing encroachment on freedoms in Hong Kong. So that's why this update is overdue.
And when you take a long-term view of geopolitical actions and actors, there's always a risk, is there not, that something like this is going to happen? I mean, the world is a changed place just from last year, never mind from the time in which the integrated review came out. Completely.
And so that's why, it has to change with the times. And, we've obviously had so many prime ministers now, sort of carousel of different characters. At least we're now going to have, continuity under Rishi, clearly. And at that point, he has to make his mark in foreign policy. He made clear during the leadership contest, candidate Rishi said that China was the number one threat.
Yeah.
We need to see if that translates in practice as Prime Minister Rishi.
And when are we expecting the review of the review to be finished? When are we thinking that's going to come?
I'm sure it'll be buried somewhere, alongside the new protocol deal. It will come out in the fullness of time.
Let's hope one of them comes out in the fullness of time. Benedict, your new book, The China Nexus, tell us a little bit about that quickly.
Well, thank you. It's an attempt basically to look at the entire picture. So it looks at the genocide of the Uyghurs, the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, continuing atrocities in Tibet, which often get overlooked, persecution of Christians, forced organ harvesting, and also Taiwan, and then a final chapter on what we do about it all.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for bringing that in, and thank you for coming into the studio. It's always a better discussion when you're both here, so thank you very much, Asa and Benedict, for having that discussion about China, about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and indeed the Uyghurs as well. But you've been watching The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster. The show is back every Friday from 2 p.m. Up next, it's the wonderful Patrick Christie's. He'll keep you up to date with everything that's happening. I'll see you next week.
Good afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office. Saturday promises lighter winds compared to today as Storm Otto pulls away. Most of us will have a dry day, and for most of us, it'll be pretty mild. There is Storm Otto hitting Denmark pretty hard through Friday evening. There is another low following on behind, but this one is nowhere near as intense. It will be bringing outbreaks of rain through the evening to Northern Ireland and to Scotland, and it will bring some snowfall over the hills of Scotland through parts of the Grampians and the Highlands in particular. Some of the higher routes here could see a few centimetres of snow, mostly rain at low levels, but could be icy as well as temperatures fall down close to or a touch below freezing. Further south, we are a long way from any ice and snow. A very mild night here with temperatures starting the weekend at 10 or 11 Celsius. A bit damp first thing for South Wales and southwest England. That rain should peter out, staying fairly dank and drizzly through central Scotland and northern parts of Northern Ireland. Northern Scotland much brighter.